Hi again. Talking today a little bit about the Greek origins of rhetoric. My name is Adam Ellwanger. I'm associate professor at University of Houston downtown, and I'm doing this series of lectures for my English 5317 course on rhetorical theory. So we're preparing to read Plato's Phaedrus. And before we get into that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the context in which rhetoric is emerging in ancient Greece. So first we should probably talk about when we're talking about ancient Greece. And the peak of Greek society in the ancient world was really the 5th century BC. And so really the 400s BC. So 500 to 400 BC. So we're talking about about 2,500 years ago, 2,500 years ago, which really in historical terms feels super distant from us, but really it's kind of not that far back in human civilization, really. So humans had always used rhetoric, right? That's an inherent quality of the human animal, is that we use symbols and other means to convey information and to persuade people. So there was nothing new about rhetoric as an activity in this period during ancient Greece. But what was new was rhetoric as theory that emerged during this time. So really, at least as far as our records that exist show, it was during this time in ancient Greece that people started to try to theorize rhetoric, which had always been a part of human interaction. And so they said, well, what principles could we use to guide persuasion and communication? And the first people who were doing this came to be known as Sophists. So there were people in Greece who were educated people, writers, logographers, who were willing to sell their services to people who perhaps were not educated, who had public needs, right? Maybe they had a court case that they were involved in and needed a speech for that event, or maybe they needed to petition someone with some power in their community for one reason or another. Well, the people who filled this niche came to be known as the Sophists, people who would accept payment to provide instruction for people to be more effective in communication. Sophism, it in that sense, sounds sort of blah, but there was a lot more to it than that. In fact, out of the community of Sophists grew an idea or a set of ideas about truth, about society, about ethics, and the Sophists now are kind of celebrated in contemporary rhetorical theory circles, precisely because they had a conception of truth that was more agnostic and subjective than certain forms of truth now, where we say that we know the truth about X or Y, right, and that that's located in an objective reality that's ordered, that we can understand, and that can be revealed. The Sophists understood that truth was something that was more related to context and also to communication. That communication in some ways forms truth and produces it, rather than truth being located outside of us. Partly because of these sort of unorthodox at the time views on truth, and partly because of their shadiness financially. They had a reputation for kind of ripping people off. Certain segments of Greek society thought that Sophism, or the Sophists, were a problem. In this context, we find Plato writing, and Plato has a very negative opinion on the Sophists and on Sophistic understandings of rhetoric. And so that's the first thing that we need to understand when we're reading Plato's writing that relates to rhetoric, is that he's writing in response to people who are high-profile movers and shakers in Greece, who may not share his opinion on the dangers of rhetoric and sophism. So in some sense, they're polemical pieces. They have a target, and they angrily criticize that target. What else? I suppose we should talk about what sophistic rhetoric looked like. If we look at Gorgias's Encomium of Helen, the sophist Gorgias writes in a very thick, decorous style, right? There's a lot of sound devices. And I'll read maybe the first passage from the fragment to Gorgias, so that you can hear what that sounds like. Okay, sorry, took me a minute to find it. If you have the rhetorical tradition, this is on page 44. So listen carefully to how this sounds rhetorically. What is becoming to a city is manpower, to a body beauty, to a soul wisdom, to an action virtue, to a speech truth, and the opposites of these things are unbecoming. Man and woman and speech and deed and city and object should be honored with praise if praiseworthy, and incur blame if unworthy. For it is an equal error and mistake to blame the praisable and to praise the blamable. It is the duty of one and the same man both to speak the needful rightly and to refute the unrightfully spoken. So if you listen to that, it's very verbose, right? It has a lot of figures of speech, right? It plays with word arrangement, and it's very difficult to follow, right? The sophists were looking to use rhetoric to enchant on some level, and indeed, later in Encomium of Helen, Gorgias compares rhetoric to how drugs work. And so it's really trying to cast a spell on an audience. And this is one of the points of criticism of sophism from the Platonic position, is that what it tries to do is just conquer people. And that just that sheer will to power isn't really a very ethical way to communicate. So there was this reputation that sophistic rhetoric elevated style over substance. And so here we have the first idea that persists even today, that rhetoric is just sort of empty verbiage, right? But that critique was around as soon as sophism emerged, and people were saying, look, this is a lot of words and they're pretty, but there's no central idea, there's no truth to it. So let's talk a little bit about Plato and who he is. So Plato was Socrates' student. We don't have anything that Socrates wrote. We don't know if he wrote. What we do have is the writings of his student Plato. And these writings are generally in the form of a dialogue. This was Plato's favored style of engagement, a dialogue. He called this dialectic, right? And what he liked about dialectic is that it's interactive, right? It's where we talk in a dialogue to one another, and we're willing to refute one another. So you advance a set of claims that you say are true, and then I respond saying, well, what about this example that seems to contradict your account? Or what about that example? And then you refine your position in light of my response, And the idea is that through dialectic, we're getting closer and closer to a truth, or to the truth, out of our testing of one another. So dialectic, as Plato understands it, is a tool to get to truth or knowledge or episteme. That's much different than the Sophists, who engage in a rhetoric of display. Theirs is monologic. They like to give a monologue. They like to give speeches at the festivals. Plato, as an adherent of dialectic, doesn't like the monologue. What he wants to have is a conversation, right? Not a display of oratorical prowess. Okay, so you probably know the story of Socrates and his death. He eventually, this wise man Socrates, gets put on trial for corrupting the Athenian youth. And Plato and many other contemporaries of the time, Xenophon and others, are really surprised that he's ultimately put to death on this charge. And what this does to Plato is awaken in him a real skepticism of democracy. Plato feels that Socrates, his teacher, was wronged in being put to a jury of just people from Athens. He feels like these people were below Socrates, and that had they had the capacity to understand Socrates' philosophical project, then they would have recognized that it was a terrible thing to put him to death. And this anti-democratic impulse is pretty strong throughout Plato's writing. And the writing that he does, he uses Socrates as a character. We don't really know where Plato might be adding his own beliefs and putting them in Socrates' mouth. But either way, we come to know Socrates through Plato's representation of him. So Plato, his lifespan is just probably shortly after or at the tail end of this period. Plato lives, this is approximate dates, about 428 to 348 BC. So around there. Of course, the line of succession in the Platonic school of philosophy is very clear. Aristotle is Plato's student, and Aristotle, of course, is a great thinker of rhetoric in his own right. And of course, Aristotle goes on to teach Alexander the Great, who would go on to conquer much of the known world. Into this milieu, we get Plato's Phaedrus. And in a few moments, I will produce a separate video where we talk about the Phaedrus specifically.
Thank you.